Put down the ladder. Step away from my column, before you embarrass yourself in front of the press. The voice cut across the gleaming new atrium. Precise, cold. 200 guests in cocktail black turned from their champagne to watch. The maintenance man did not come down. He stood near the top of an 8-foot ladder, one gloved hand flat against the base of a soaring column, head tilted, the way a man listens for something under a hood. Shaved head. 3 days of gray stubble, a jaw like a set anchor, forearms thick and scarred. The gray work uniform did nothing to hide what was under it. He did not look like hired help. He looked like something a falling building would have to get through first. A little boy sat at the foot of the ladder, 7 years old, building a tower out of sugar cubes he had stolen from the coffee cart. He did not look up. He was used to people telling his father to leave. Ma'am, the super said, not turning around, voice low and level. There's a hairline running the full height of this column that wasn't in it Tuesday, and the expansion joint at the mezzanine has opened about 4 millimeters since the crowd loaded in. Under a static crowd, that's ugly. If anything shakes this building tonight, a bad gust, a bus in the loading dock, anything, I do not want 200 people standing under this mezzanine. Give me 20 minutes. Let me pull the guests back behind the fountain. Nora Vale looked at him the way she looked at anything that dared question the structure, which, after 12 years, was the one thing she could not abide. Blonde hair pinned back into something severe and perfect, a face you could not stop looking at, and a mouth that had forgotten how to be kind. Beautiful, the way a blueprint is beautiful, all clean lines and nothing wasted. Chief Design Officer of the Meridian Project, the architect whose name was on every drawing, and the coldest thing in a room full of glass. You change the air filters, she said. You reset the breakers. You are not the engineer of record. You do not read my columns. You do not interpret my joints. And you do not move my guests. This building passed every inspection the city has. She turned to a security lead. He's done for the night. Walk him out. And someone move the child off the event floor before a photographer catches him. The super came down the ladder, slow, all 6 feet and change of him, folding down rung by rung like a bridge being lowered. And he did not argue. He peeled off one glove, reached down, and took his son's hand. He had been walked out of 100 rooms by people who would need him later and never once guess it. Here is what nobody in that atrium knew, not Nora, not the guard already stepping toward him. The nobody she had just dismissed had crawled into collapsed buildings 22 times, through dust and dark and the specific silence of things that want to finish falling, to pull out people the rubble had already claimed. And in 90 seconds, the mezzanine he was pointing at would be on top of half the room. To understand how a decorated combat engineer ends up mopping marble for hourly pay, you have to go back to a lot number stamped on a piece of cheap steel, a number that had already destroyed one of their lives and was about to try for both. His name was Eli Marsh. He was 43, and he had once worn oak leaves and commanded men whose whole job was to know exactly how and why things fall down. Nobody at Meridian Tower knew that. They knew Quiet Eli, the super who could tell you which pump was about to fail by the hum in the wall, who never raised his voice, who wore a wedding ring on a uniform with no dress code and kept it, because taking it off felt like burying Dana twice. They knew the scars ran up under his sleeves, and they knew, without being told, not to ask. He had been an Army combat engineer, a sapper, and then, when they saw how his mind worked, an officer, Major Marsh. The man they flew in to look at a building after the worst had happened and tell them whether it was safe to send people back inside. He could read a crack the way other men read a face. He could shore a failing void with a fraction of the timber the manual called for and be right. He could crawl into a space every instinct screamed to run from, because someone was alive in there, and the math said he had 4 minutes. And then there was the collapse that put the first names on the inside of his arm. An annex overseas that came down, not from a bomb, as everyone first assumed, from fraudulent steel a contractor had swapped to skim a margin. Eli had crawled in 3 times. He had brought out 4 men. He had not brought out 3. And when he came home and told the truth about why the building fell, named the contractor, named the fraud, The machine closed ranks. The contract money talked, and a major who would not stop talking about substituted steel found his career quietly, thoroughly ended. 2 years after they pushed him out, his wife Dana was killed by a driver who ran a light. And Eli watched his whole remaining world shrink to one boy named Theo, who learned to fall asleep only with his father's hand flat on his back, because the world had already proven it could take a mother in the time it takes a light to change. So Eli Marsh folded the uniform into a footlocker, and he took the smallest, quietest job he could find, running maintenance in a building 40 minutes from Theo's school. Because it meant he was home for breakfast. Every single morning. He was not hiding out of shame. He was hiding because the man who could do what he had done had learned exactly what it cost to be the one who was right about a building, and he had decided the safest thing he could give the world was to stay small, gray, uniformed, and close to the one small person who still needed his hand on his back. Now cross the atrium, to the woman who had just fired him. Nora Vale had a rule she never said out loud: trust the structure, never the people, because people cut corners and then hand you the blame. 12 years ago, she had been the brilliant young engineer of record on the Halstead pedestrian bridge. An elegant thing, her design, her calculations, her name. 6 months after it opened, during a street festival, it came down. 7 people died. The investigation found her. Of course it found her. Her name was on the drawings. What the investigation buried, in a subclause no headline ever quoted, was this: Nora had filed 3 written objections when the general contractor substituted a cheaper steel than her specification called for. And she had been overruled by the firm's principal partner, who assured the city the substitute was equivalent. It was not equivalent, but the objections were internal, and the principal was well connected, and the story that was cheaper than the truth was the one the world got. Young architect, in over her head, fatal miscalculation. Her career should have ended in that windowless hearing room. Instead, she did something colder and harder. She rebuilt. She became flawless and feared and relentless, and she made the structure her religion: redundancy, documentation, control. Because if she could just be unimpeachable on every future building, then no one could ever again fold cheap steel into her name and let it kill people she had tried to protect. And the man who had overruled her 12 years ago, the principal who chose the cheap steel and let her take the fall, was Dorian Kell. Who's tonight standing on the reviewing platform of Meridian Tower as the lead developer, silver and smiling, her partner on the biggest project of her life. She had spent 3 years working beside the man who destroyed her, cold and patient, quietly pulling the Meridian steel invoices, because from the inside someday she might catch him doing it again. What she did not know, could not know, was that the annex that fell overseas and ended a certain army major's career had been built on steel routed through one of Dorian Kell's supply networks. The same fraud, the same lot logic, a different country, a different building, the same man's margin. And when a scarred maintenance man put his gloved hand on her column tonight and told her quietly, certainly, that her steel was moving, every alarm she owned went off at once. Because for 12 years, the structure had been the only thing that ever told her the truth. And this stranger had just spoken in its voice. They did not walk him out right away, because a signature was needed, and because a 7-year-old had a question. Theo had wandered 2 steps toward the great column, staring up its height, then back at his father, where the sleeve had ridden up, reaching for the ladder rail. "Your names are showing, Dad," he said. Eli tugged the sleeve down out of habit, but not before a young project engineer glanced at the inside of his scarred forearm and went still. It was a unit crest, a castle over crossed pickaxes, one word beneath it, sapper, and under that, inked in a neat column, 4 names. 3 had a small castle beside them. The 4th did not. "Say them again," Theo said, the way he asked for a bedtime story. "Not here, bud. You said you carry them so nobody stays down in the dark by himself." Eli crouched to his level. Because he could never refuse that particular sentence, he ran a thumb once down the column of names. That's right, he said quietly. Engineers have a rule, Theo. When something comes down, you get out everyone you can, and the ones you can't reach in time, you carry their names, so that even under all of it, nobody stays buried, Theo finished. Solemn. 7 years old, and sure of it. Nobody stays buried, Eli said, and he pulled the sleeve down over the fourth name, the one with no castle beside it, because that soldier had not died under the annex. He had just walked out of the army afterward and stopped being a man who could say the names in uniform. Across the atrium, a small orchestra struck up. On the platform, Dorian Kell handed Nora Vale an oversized pair of ribbon scissors while photographers arranged the shot. And 200 guests pressed in under the gleaming mezzanine to watch the Meridian Tower officially open. And deep in the structure, exactly where the super had rested his glove, the hairline in the column drew 1 thin millimeter longer. Up on the platform, Dorian Kell put a warm, dry hand on Nora's shoulder and told her to smile for the cameras. Kell was Meridian's lead developer, silver-haired, expensively calm, the man who had rescued Nora's career after Halstead by bringing her onto his projects, which meant he was the man who had spent 12 years keeping her close, useful, and quiet. He had no idea. The cold woman beside him had spent 3 years pulling his steel invoices. He thought he had tamed her. He had no idea she had taken his hand only to reach the paper. Big night, Kell said. Pentagon of retail, the mayor calls it. Let's not have your maintenance man making faces about hairlines. Confidence, Nora. A building is about confidence. Nora said nothing. She was looking at the column and hearing a super's flat, certain voice. Your expansion joints opened 4 millimeters since the crowd loaded in. In 12 years of men in good suits telling her a building was fine. That gray, uniformed stranger was the first person who had told her it wasn't, like he had seen the inside of one that failed. At 8:52 p.m., a magnitude the region called minor, and the Meridian Tower called fatal, rolled up out of the ground. A short, hard jolt. The kind an honest building shrugs off. Meridian Tower was not an honest building. Somewhere in its bones, steel that had been specified one way and delivered another gave up all at once. The cracked column let go. The overstressed expansion joint tore, and 40 feet of loaded steel and marble mezzanine folded down into the atrium, onto the champagne, onto the orchestra, onto the 200 people gathered under it to celebrate. The sound it made was one Nora Vale had heard exactly once before in her life, 12 years ago, from a bridge. The specific, world-ending crack of her own structure coming down on people she had tried to save. The atrium came apart in dust and screaming. Guests ran the wrong way, deeper in, toward the far wall, into the part of the mezzanine that had not finished falling. Security froze. Dorian Kell's first instinct, God help him, was to grab his phone and start dictating to his lawyer. And Nora Vale stood on the platform, with her hands white on the rail. 12 years old again, in her guilt, watching her structure crush people she could not reach, because there is nothing an architect on a platform can do about a slab that's already down. Except one man was already moving toward it. Eli Marsh had put Theo into the arms of the young project engineer. Do not move. Do not follow. Dad is coming back. That's a promise. The instant the ground jolted, because his body knew what that jolt meant before his mind did. And now he was going against the current of the fleeing crowd, straight at the settling mountain of slab and dust, shrugging his uniform shirt off one shoulder for range of motion, the scars on his arms catching the emergency lights. He reached the debris field, and he did not climb onto it like a panicking bystander. He read it. 3 seconds, eyes moving along, load paths only he could see. Then he went to a specific spot and started pulling, because he knew which pile was holding weight and which was just noise, and where the voids would be, the pockets where a person could still be breathing. He had done this exact work 22 times. His hands remembered the geometry, even as the dust tried to blind him. You, and you. He barked it at 2 frozen waiters, and his voice had a command in it none of them had ever heard from the super. That beam is a lever, not a wall. Get under this end, lift on 3, do not let it drop. They moved. Because people move when a certain voice tells them to. A slab lifted 6 inches. Eli went flat and slid into the gap. Up on the platform, Nora Vale stopped breathing. Because the maintenance man she had fired 90 seconds ago had just crawled into her collapsed building. Headfirst. On purpose. On purpose. And the crowd around her had gone from screaming to that specific, drowning silence of people watching someone do the impossible. He came out backward, dragging a woman by her wrists, laid her clear, and went back in without a word. Came out with a violinist still clutching his bow. Went back. Came out with a teenage caterer, then a city councilman. Then a photographer whose leg was wrong and who screamed until Eli splinted it against a length of broken conduit with a calm that shut the man up faster than any comfort could. Between trips, he never stopped directing, shoring a groaning void with a stack of table legs and a marble riser, ordering the strongest guests into a bucket line of debris. And once, rating the ceiling above the rescue, he pulled everyone back 6 feet, a full 10 seconds before a second section shed its weight, exactly where they had been standing. He knew. He always knew. The fire crews arrived to find a civilian in a torn maintenance uniform running a textbook collapse rescue better than their incident commander could have. Voids marked, load paths called, a triage line already moving. And the battalion chief, no fool, took one look and said, "Whatever he's doing, back him up," instead of pulling him out. The last void was the bad one, a pocket under the heaviest part of the fallen mezzanine, where a busboy, barely 19, was pinned and fading. Eli went in so far and stayed so long that even the fire crew went quiet, and Nora found herself gripping the rail and saying it out loud to no one. "Come out! Come out! Come out! Come out!" He came out with the kid. When they finally got Eli Marsh clear and sat him on a slab with an oxygen mask he waved off, a small voice carried across the ruined atrium, fierce and absolute. "That's my dad. Nobody stays buried. That's the rule." Nobody was laughing at the maintenance man now. Nora Vale came down off her platform the way you come down off a cliff, picking across her own broken building in ruined heels, until she reached the gray, uniformed man sitting in the dust. She crouched, and she did not know why her hands were shaking harder now than they had during the collapse. "You went into it," she said. "Nobody goes into an active collapse. I have spent 12 years around failed structures, and I have never seen a living person crawl under a loaded slab on purpose. Who taught you to?" And then his sleeve fell back from his forearm. And she saw the tattoo. A castle over crossed pickaxes. Sapper. 4 names in a neat column. 3 with small castles, 1 without. "You're an engineer," she breathed. "You're not a that hairline. The 4 millimeters. You weren't guessing. You read my building." "Combat engineer," Eli said, pulling the oxygen mask down. His voice, a gravel rasp. "Army. I spent 19 years learning why buildings fall and how to get people out when they do." He looked at the names on his arm. "And I got pushed out for telling the truth about one that fell when it shouldn't have. An annex, overseas. Everyone thought it was an attack." His jaw tightened. "It wasn't. It was steel. Somebody swapped my specified structural steel for a cheaper lot to skim the margin, and it let go under load, and it came down on my men. I crawled in 3 times. I got 4 out." He touched the 3 names with castles. "I didn't get these 3. And when I came home and named the fraud, the money made sure a major who wouldn't shut up about substituted steel never worked again." Nora Vale went very, very still. "Substituted steel," she whispered. "A cheaper lot, swapped after the fact." Something 12 years old and buried was clawing its way up through her chest. "What was the lot? The steel that came down on your men. Do you remember the lot number?" Eli looked at her, and something in his scarred face shifted, because he had heard the change in her voice too. "I'll never forget it," he said. "I kept a peace." Dorian Kell arrived with his lawyer and a face arranged into grief, and he made the single greatest mistake of his career. "This man is an unqualified employee who entered a hazard zone against every protocol," Kell announced, loud, for the news cameras that were absolutely still rolling. He is a liability, not a hero. Nora, come away from him. We'll let the professionals. He just brought 11 people out of the building you built, Dorian, Nora said, without looking away from Eli. Be quiet. And Eli Marsh, gray with dust, reached into a cargo pocket that had ridden through 22 collapses and a court-martial's worth of hearings, and he drew out a small object wrapped in a rag. A coupon of sheared structural steel, edge-stamped with a lot number and a mill code. Kept for 12 years, the way another man keeps a photograph. I pulled this out of the annex myself, Eli said. The piece that failed, and I kept it, because it was the thing that killed my men, and I wanted the number that did it. He held it up so the cameras caught the stamp. I could never get anyone to act on it, a broken major with a chunk of rebar. The supply chain was a maze. Shell companies, brokers, no face at the top I could ever put in a room. He turned the steel in his scarred fingers and looked at Nora. But you filed objections, didn't you? 12 years ago, about a substituted steel, before your bridge came down. Nora Vale stood, slowly, the piece of steel now in her own hand. She turned it to the light, and she read the lot logic she had memorized in a windowless room 12 years ago and never once been allowed to say out loud. It's the same broker, she said, and her voice shook, the same substitution pattern. Halstead, your annex. She turned to Dorian Kell, and 12 years of ice cracked into something molten. And Meridian, it's you. It was always you. You overruled my objections on the bridge and let 7 people die with my name on it. You skimmed the same steel through a network that came down on his men in another country, and you did it again, here, tonight, in a building full of people. Because you have never once in your life paid for the cheap steel. So why would you ever stop buying it? Nora, Kell started, you're in shock. You can't possibly. I have 3 years of your Meridian invoices, she said. I have my original Halstead objections. I never had the annex. I never had proof it was a pattern, and not just my word against yours. She looked at Eli, at the steel coupon, at the names on his arm. He just crawled out of your collapse and handed it to me. Kell lunged for the steel. One last panicked grab, as if the metal were the truth and the truth could be pocketed. He never reached it. Eli Marsh's dust-caked hand closed around the developer's wrist like a clamp torqued to spec. And the most powerful man in the room was suddenly on his knees in the rubble beside the man he had called hired help, held there without visible effort by a sapper who had just spent everything he had on 11 strangers and had exactly nothing left to fear from a man in a suit. Nobody, Eli said quietly, stays buried, not my men, not her name, not any more. The reckoning that followed did not take long. Because it is very hard to argue with a matching lot number on 3 separate catastrophes, an architect's 12-year-old written objections, a decorated engineer's sworn testimony, a physical steel coupon, and live footage of a developer trying to grab it off the rubble. But the thing that mattered most to Nora Vale happened 5 weeks later, in a hearing room with tall windows, this time, when the state formally reopened the Halstead finding and struck her name from the cause. The old conclusion, engineer error, fatal miscalculation, gone. Replaced with the truth. The engineer of record had objected, in writing, 3 times, to a steel substitution she did not authorize and was overruled on. She had done everything right. The man who chose the cheap steel had done everything wrong, and for 12 years the wrong person had carried the 7 names. Nora did not cry in the hearing room. She waited until she was in the stairwell, alone. And then she came apart for 12 years, all at once. Not just the grief of the 7. She had carried that every day, but the grief of finally setting down the lie stacked on top of it. My miscalculation, my fault, my name. Gone. Replaced with the truth. She had never miscalculated. She had been right, and been overruled, and been blamed, and a boardroom had stolen even her innocence to protect a margin. And then she drove to a small apartment, 40 minutes from a tower that no longer bore her shame. And she knocked on the door of the man who had handed her back her name. And when Eli Marsh opened it, a dish towel over one shoulder, a 7-year-old peering around his hip, Nora Vale, the most controlled woman in the industry, did not have a single prepared word. "You carried that steel for 12 years, she said. "You knew there was a fraud with no face, and you mopped my floors for a year and said nothing. Why?" "Because the last time I told you your building was moving, you fired me," Eli said, the ghost of a smile. And then, gentler, "And because I didn't know the fraud had a name until you said Halstead in the dust. I'd read about your bridge. Everyone in my world had. I just believed the story they sold, same as everyone." He shook his head. "You'd built a whole fortress out of being unimpeachable. I didn't know how to knock on that door and tell you I had a piece of the thing that framed you, so I kept my head down and waited. Turns out the building knocked for both of us." Theo decided he liked the architect lady, mostly because she knew, without being told, that you say all 4 names, and you say the 3 with castles a little slower than the rest. Here is the lesson, and it deserves to be said without decoration. We are taught that power keeps us safe. The title, the firm, the name on the drawings, the authority to walk the small people out of the room. Nora Vale had all of it, more command of a structure than almost anyone alive, and it did not lift one slab, and it did not, for 12 years, clear her own name. What did both was a man everyone had decided was nothing. A scarred super mopping marble for hourly pay, who had once been strong in one of the rarest ways there is, and had walked away from all of it to make breakfast for a little boy. The strongest person in that atrium was not the woman on the platform holding the scissors. It was the man who went into the thing everyone else ran from, and then asked for no credit at all. And the laziest cruelty we practice is looking at the quiet person cleaning up after us, and deciding they have nothing left to give. Right up until the moment they are the only one who does. Nora had spent 12 years believing her mistake had killed 7 people. It took a second collapse, and a witness who had carried the proof in his pocket like a wound that would not close, to teach her the truth she had needed the whole time. She had never made the mistake, she had tried to stop it, and been overruled, and been buried under someone else's crime, and now, at last, she was out from under it. Nobody stays buried. Dorian Kell's development empire did not survive the year, and good riddance to it. But out of the wreckage rose something with a name Nora insisted on, the Halstead Standard, a materials verification protocol requiring third-party lot testing on every load of structural steel, adopted first by the city, and then, quietly, by the industry. On the wall of the small firm Nora, rebuilt from scratch, hung the single object behind glass. A fire and dust-blackened coupon of sheared steel, its lot number still legible, kept as a promise. Eli did not take the settlement Nora's lawyers pushed at him either. He took a daytime job running structural safety inspections for the new standard, with one rule in writing: home for breakfast, every morning, no exceptions. He knew, better than anyone, what it costs the small people who wait at home when a man keeps crawling into the dark. He was done making Theo wait for anything. But on a Sunday in early autumn, in a park where the light was long and gold, and the moon was already a pale disk in the daytime sky, Nora Vale stood beside a scarred man, watching 2 boys build a tower out of wooden blocks in the grass. Hers, borrowed for the afternoon. His, and for a long while neither of them said anything at all. "You still carry them?" she finally asked. "The names." Eli turned his forearm over, where the 4 names sat healed and dark. "Every day," he said, "but they're lighter now. For 12 years I carried them like a man who couldn't prove why they died." He looked at her. "Now I carry them like a man who finally got to put the truth in a room with cameras, and put the man who bought the steel on his knees in the rubble." Across the grass, Theo's tower got exactly 1 block too tall and came down, and the boy shrieked with laughter and started digging his toy men out of the pile. "Rescue! Rescue! Nobody stays buried!" "Copy that, bud," Eli called, and his voice caught, "Nobody stays buried." And Nora Valley, who had spent 12 years, branded the woman whose building killed 7 and been handed back her name by a man everyone else had walked out of the room, stood beside the quiet giant in the ordinary gold light. 4 names on his arm. 2 boys in the grass. And she let herself, for the first time in 12 years, simply belong somewhere that no one could take from her. If you believe the strongest person in the room is almost never the loudest, that real courage crawls into the dark and then asks for none of the credit, type the words, "Nobody stays buried," in the comments. If his rule, "You carry the ones you couldn't reach," landed somewhere in your chest, hit the like button so more people hear it. And subscribe. Because the next story is about a night shift dispatcher, everyone treated like a voice on a headset at a billionaire's private airfield. Until the fog rolled in. The tower went dark, and the only person who could talk a crippled plane full of families down to the ground was the one they'd never let sit in the tower.